All right, we started recording. We'll hop in. So, hello everyone. I know most of you. Thank you so much for being here on this beautiful Tuesday night. Thank you also to Ithaca DSA for hosting these wonderful socialist night schools every month. I really love them, always learn a lot. Really enjoyed the discussions. And thanks for inviting me to speak and for agreeing to listen to me for a little bit. I also want to just start by giving a big shout out to the Starbucks union in Ithaca, where 3 stores just voted in a landslide to unionize this past week, part of a national movement that is helping to transform our society. And some comrades were involved locally, and much love and solidarity to them. And of course also to the Amazon labor union. Both of these things, give us some hope for the future. And with that, the title of my talk is Eco-Socialism or Extinction, Social Ecology and Radical Democracy. So my talk starts with the premise that I think we probably all accept and feel deep in our bones, that we are hurtling towards climate catastrophe, that unless we drastically change something, we're going to keep perpetrating the 6th great extinction events in the Earth's history because of our actions, and that we as humanity might even be included in this extinction event. So it truly is eco-socialism or extinction. These are the stakes of what we are facing. We know what the science says, right? We know how grim the future looks. But what can we do about it? The only solution, the eco-socialists say, is to fundamentally restructure our society, to deconstruct this economic system called capitalism that is rewarding a small group of people for destroying the planet and also exploiting and oppressing the rest of us. And we need to build a new society in its place, a more humane, democratic, socialist, egalitarian, ecological society. So this is our only hope for a livable future. Again, eco-socialism or extinction. So in the next 15, 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give a very brief overview of social ecology and its implications for our own local political practice. So here's the plan. I want you to come away with an understanding of 3 aspects of social ecology. First, its general analysis of the world, that ecological problems are fundamentally rooted in social problems, primarily that a small group of capitalists is making an enormous amount of profit by destroying the planet, and thus addressing the climate crisis requires fundamentally changing how we organize society itself, not just tweaking at the margins and making different individual choices, but fundamentally restructuring society. As Naomi Klein put it so well, this changes everything. Second is a corresponding vision of radical democracy and social transformation that Murray Bookchin, who's the primary theorist of social ecology, calls Libertarian Municipalism, which is a terrible, title, mouthful, not sexy at all, but the name doesn't matter. The way to fix these social problems that are causing the ecological catastrophe is to transform our politics, to build radical democracy from the ground up so that we have control over our own lives, over our own communities, and over our own society. So that since it is in the interests of the vast majority of humanity to not destroy the planet, we can actually have the power to collectively make the decision to not destroy the planet. So we do this through building democratic assemblies from the ground up, through building cooperative economics, through labor struggles to build unions, which are forces for democracy in the workplace, to engage in social struggles against exploitation and oppression, and even sometimes to engage in local electoral work. Then third, I'll end by talking about a couple practical examples of, so one time in history, Burlington, Vermont in the 1980s, where I'll address the relationship between democratic assemblies and the local government led by Mayor Bernie Sanders. And then end by talking about Ithaca, including some thoughts about what this could mean for our own political work. I say Cooperation Jackson on the slide there. I think I'm going to have to cut it in the interest of time, but happy to talk about it, of course. Okay. Part 1, Introduction to Social Ecology. So Murray Bookchin opens the piece that we read today by saying that social ecology is based on the conviction that nearly all of our present ecological problems originate in deep-seated social problems. So ecological problems, the devastation of the natural world, the extinction of countless new species every day, these ecological problems are rooted in social problems, which is to say, it's rooted in how we organize our society. Who holds power? Who has the capacity to make the real decisions that impact our lives? Who owns the means of production, the factories that produce the goods that we use? And then who actually produces these things? Who does the labor? Who does the work and what they actually produce? Fundamentally, what are the social relationships that lie at the foundation of our society? So ecological catastrophe is not about the fact that we don't recycle enough, or we accidentally put the wrong kind of plastic in the recycling yesterday and so it's not going to work, or that we take too long of showers, that we eat too much meat. It's not about our individual choices that are destroying the planet, right? These decisions are made for us in how we structure our entire society. And social ecology argues that human hierarchy and domination comes first, that social hierarchies come first, and then they are projected onto the natural world. It is the very fact that we organize our society in a hierarchical, domineering fashion that enables us to relate to the natural world by dominating it, by exploiting it, by extracting resources from it. So Murray Bookchin makes this argument at length in his book, The Ecology of Freedom, which I definitely recommend, in which he argues that, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in essentially egalitarian societies, right? Which were generally lived in harmony with the natural world before the rise and institutionalization of hierarchical structures, specifically patriarchy and gerontocracy, which Bookchin says came first. Gerontocracy ruled by the old, patriarchy ruled by men. And that these started to naturalize hierarchical structures of command, of obedience, of distinct and unequal social roles that different people play, and eventually of the exploitation, the extraction of value from people that are lower in the system. So it's only once this social transformation takes place that humans begin to dominate the natural world. So as Bookchin says in this slide, the very notion of the domination of nature by man stems from the very real domination of human by human. So hierarchy and domination in the human world gives rise to the very idea that nature exists outside of us, that it is the other, that it is lower on the hierarchical system than we are, that the entire natural world is also hierarchically organized, as is human society, and that it can and in fact should be dominated by humans, that we should control it, that we should extract resources from it. And of course, this is in many ways deeper than capitalism, and it goes right to the heart of social hierarchy in general. But capitalism has greatly accelerated this process and enabled truly global ecological destruction. Now, of course, this is not true of all people, right? Not all human societies. Many societies have had a much different relationship with the natural world than do the white Western capitalist societies. But unfortunately, capitalism has transformed the entire world in its own image and is actively attempting to destroy any other way of organizing society and organizing our lives And in fact, there is a lot of profit to be had in doing so. And even if it is ultimately against our interests as humanity for capitalism to destroy the world, it is very profitable for individual capitalists and multinational corporations to do this. Despite whatever green rebranding many corporations are attempting to carry out, we aren't going to win by appealing to the morality of individual capitalists, but rather we need to recognize that this is a social struggle between competing interests. The interests of the vast majority of humanity versus the short-term interests of the capitalist class. Thus, the only solution, the only real solution to the environmental catastrophe that we find ourselves in is to challenge the class power of the capitalist elites, to challenge their ability to control society and to make the decisions to continue dominating and destroying the natural world. This is the only way to end capitalism's destruction of the planet, to transform our society and build social relationships based in equality and true freedom. So we must stop dominating each other as well as the planet. And this requires, again, fundamentally reconstructing society, not just putting new people at the top who have better ideas, but rather decentralizing society, basing it in local production, democratically controlled local production as much as possible, meeting everybody's material needs from local sources, using alternative energy sources, running the economy democratically, building community gardens, doing all of these things together with the full participation of everyone making the decisions that affect our lives. This is the only way to establish the conditions for full human development and to integrate our lives and communities with the natural world. So how do we get there? How do we build this new ecological society that is run democratically at the grassroots, that is, harmoniously integrated with the natural world instead of dominating it, and in which we have true freedom and equality and self-determination from the ground up? This requires a radical conception of democracy built from the bottom up, which again, Murray Bookchin calls Libertarian Municipalism, where instead of decisions being made by elites who supposedly represent our interests, whether in governments through elected officials or in the boards of multinational corporations, we have to make collective decisions about our own lives. We have to get the power to be able to make the decision to not destroy the planet. So the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we build the structures that enable us and empower us to make those kinds of decisions? So this doesn't just mean, doing local politics. It's a fundamental reconceptualization and transformation of how we think about democracy and how we think about politics. So democracy and democratic politics doesn't mean just, showing up every 4 years to vote for representatives, the lesser of two evils that is going to screw you over anyway, but is a little better than the other side. True democracy means the collective governing of our lives and society, empowering all of us to make the decisions about things that affect our lives. So Bookchin makes a distinction between what he calls statecraft versus what he calls politics. And statecraft is a hierarchical command vision of politics, or organized from the top down, where we alienate, we give away our political decision-making capacity to a higher body that rules, again, supposedly in our interest, that supposedly represents us with varying degrees of input from regular people. But it fundamentally takes the power outside of our hands and puts it into the hands of a small group of elites who, turns out, tend to share the interests of the capitalist class. Politics, on the other hand, true democratic politics, is what happens at a local level as we figure out how to live our lives in common, how to make collective decisions about the things that affect us. In the 1960s, people usually called this participatory democracy. But this requires new kinds of structures and institutions, what Bookchin sometimes calls forms of freedom. Freedom requires forms, right? And these forms enable a different kind of democratic decision-making. And they're based in assemblies and in discussion, in debates, in voting, and doing this in every aspect of our lives, right? To fundamentally democratize all aspects of our lives, from our workplaces to our neighborhoods to our cities, and even the homes that we live in. And this is a way of thinking in terms of dual power, right? Of building new institutions that offer alternatives to the state, alternatives to capitalist social relations, to try to build power from below with the intent of overthrowing and replacing these hierarchical systems. So politics, local democratic politics, is necessarily in conflict with statecraft. In practice, Bookchin advocates two prongs of work. First, establishing grassroots assemblies and engaging in local social struggles, so building grassroots democracy and power from the ground up. And second is local electoral campaigns. So running candidates not as individuals, but rather as adherents to a political platform, as the local solidarity slate did in Ithaca. But in the municipalist division, it's not just a political platform to try to pass progressive legislation in city council, but rather is a platform for restructuring local democracy, institutionalizing things like neighborhood assemblies, institutionalizing the power of unions and workplace democracy over their workplaces, and ultimately fundamentally democratizing the economy and society. This is tied up in decentralizing and transforming agriculture and industrial production. And it also then means building from the bottom up the political forms that emanate out of the local assemblies, right? For how do you coordinate between different local decisions, et cetera. And these are all things, you know, I'm happy to go into more detail, but I'm of course running out of time. But just trying to come up with new forms to, again, structure society to flow from the bottom up rather than the top down, because it is all of these hierarchical structures, forms of domination that have led us to ecological catastrophe. So we need to, you know, fundamentally uproot all of these forms of hierarchy and build new things in their place. So what has this looked like in practice? What could it look like here? You know what? I've gone on for a little while. I'm going to skip the Burlington thing. There were debates about how to implement local radical democracy in the 80s. It's fascinating, but we're going to go ahead and just skip to an ecological vision for Ithaca. So first, so what would an eco-socialist vision of doing political work in Ithaca be? How can we go from, you know, having a vision of a transformed local economy and society and new kinds of social relations? How do we get to that vision? How do we imagine a path towards it? So this is just ending with some ideas for ways of conceptualizing this kind of local, democratic, ecological, political work. So first, of course, the overarching framework would be a democratic socialist vision for Ithaca's Green New Deal. Not as it's being played out right now, that's essentially, you know, this green capitalist vision in which these supposedly enlightened green capitalists partner with NGOs to remake our city, but rather thinking about the Green New Deal as, you know, a set of plans and programs that are democratically discussed and decided upon and democratically implemented, that would transform our society and empower regular people to have collective control over our lives. Then once we are gaining collective control over our lives, then we can make decisions to do things like establish free local public transportation, and perhaps coordinate with other communities to build high-speed rail to connect us with other places, to establish good unionized jobs in cooperatives, both in the cooperatives that already exist, like Green Star and whatnot, but also for new public works projects. For instance, to deal with the new floodplain maps that just came out, which, you know, are threatening all of downtown Ithaca, we need to address that problem collectively and democratically and figure out how to solve that problem, right? But we can do that together rather than, relying on paying each $5,000 more a year in flood insurance as they want us to do. We also need more, carbon neutral care work, right? Including free public daycare, childcare, greater investment in schools. These are all things that we can accomplish locally and that are not just progressive political planks, but that would require and enable us to restructure our lives democratically to have collective control. I think that the Lehman Alternative Community School that Aurora works at is a fantastic example of an alternative institution built from the bottom up that practices new forms of democratic decision-making, and that this is the kind of anchor institution that can contribute to other local radical democratic projects. So I think that, the Solidarity Slate was a fantastic start in terms of local electoral campaigns, running as a slate on a progressive platform that is directly connected to local movements, to radical institutions. But I think it's worth asking, what would it mean to go beyond working in the existing power structure of the city council and rather transforming how we participate in democracy in Ithaca? So creating and empowering local assemblies that regularly meet and debate local policy and make real decisions about what should happen, with the Solidarity Slate members participating and agreeing to carry out these collective decisions, figuring out how to empower local unions, local cooperatives, and remake them into something that is actually challenging capitalism. And I'll end by just saying briefly on the campaign that the DSA is focusing on this year, Free TCAT, to have free public transportation in Ithaca. I think it's a perfect example of a campaign that addresses the social issues at the heart of ecological issues. So, why is our society so reliant on cars for transportation? Why don't we fully fund public transportation? Why aren't these decisions made democratically? We never got to discuss and vote on whether or not to organize our entire society around cars and highways instead of public transportation. These decisions were made because they are profitable for the rich. Oops. And to go more locally, right? Why is Cornell tax exempt? Why does it contribute so little monetarily to Ithaca? Could we use the Free TCAT campaign to force Cornell to contribute more? And finally, how can we use this campaign to build democratic decision-making structures in Ithaca? Can neighborhoods meet to discuss their transportation needs? Can residents make decisions about bus routes? Can we build affordable, high-quality public housing in Ithaca so that people can live close to where they work instead of being forced out of town and forced to drive? These are the kinds of questions and strategic orientations that social ecology raises. This kind of campaign is not just about cutting emissions, but about fundamentally getting to the social questions at the heart of the climate crisis and building the new forms of power and local decision-making structures that we need in order to build a new world. So the project of saving the planet and the project of fighting for democratic socialism are thus intimately connected. I'll end there. Thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Spencer. You went a little over time, but you mentioned LACS and trains, so we'll forgive you. Can you stop sharing? Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Should we stop recording?
Maybe we should leave it recording for the Q&A. I feel like that could be useful. So we're just gonna have a few minutes of Q&A where folks can ask Spencer more specifics if you want to ask about the Bernie stuff or anything that he said or any ideas that came to mind. You can put a star in the chat to get on stack, to ask a question or share a comment. Go ahead, Teresa, start us off.
Well, I'm worried about this great reliance on assemblies because I'm afraid any reliance on, large meetings with lots of public input, as I have seen it, tends to mean that the same affluent people who have, who can send somebody else to clean house or cook for them have the time to go to those meetings, and people who have to work for a living don't have that kind of time, and people who have children don't have that kind of time. So, I mean, I just see that kind of attempt to democratize as problematic.
Yeah, no, thanks for raising that. I totally agree with you, right? I think that like trying to just implement like town hall assemblies in our current capitalist society, yeah, was going to reproduce a lot of the structures that you just said and the inequalities. And that's why I think that, you know, we should think about democratizing all aspects of our society, right? Starting in our workplaces, you know, so thinking about building a union as, you know, building a workplace assembly. You know, it's about building these democratic structures in the places that actually most affect us first. So building unions, building neighborhood assemblies, and also, you know, building unions so that we can get paid more and work less so that we actually have time to participate in other assemblies, having free childcare so that, again, we actually have time to participate in other assemblies, right? I think that it all kind of fits together, and none of it works unless it's this full, you know, multi-pronged approach.
Thanks, Spencer. Deirdre, and then we can skip me and go to Kathy.
I wasn't planning to speak to Teresa's point, but I will for a minute, that it also has to do with people feeling comfortable expressing themselves, which gets back to education and the importance of LACS. When my kids who graduated decades ago argue about the value of LACS, my son says, they didn't have us read Shakespeare. And my daughter says, but they had us get up in front of 200 people and say what we thought. And we learned how to do that, and we've carried that into our lives. And that's something that needs to be part of education. But what I was actually planning to say, when Spencer mentioned the floodplains, I was suddenly thinking that the city of Ithaca could self-insure for flood damage rather than private individuals, and finance it through a progressive financing mechanism like an income tax or a property tax targeted at higher value properties.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Deirdre.
That's an awesome idea, Deirdre. Let's go to Kathy.
Hi there. I really liked your presentation. Your slides were great, so thank you so much. I think that there's a lot of other social ecologists that could have been centered on rather than a libertarian. I can't get behind libertarians. And so I think that the interest, no, communists are not libertarians. Libertarians are individualists, and the root word of liberty comes from libertas, which means the right to exclude. Look at Christopher Hill's history of England in the 1600s. Anyway, I think that Teresa raises a really interesting point about the difficulty of popular assemblies. And I mean, I know that Argentina used them really, really well. And that they had factories that were taken over by the workers themselves, and they organized and were connected with the people who were doing popular assemblies. And there was a whole uprising in their society. So, we can learn a lot from that. But I think Ithaca, it is going to be very difficult to have assemblies because people don't have the time. And there's no longer really in effect an 8-hour day or a 5-day work week. And there's just a lot that we can look at, but it's cooperative and collective municipalism, I think, is something we can look at really, really carefully. And there are people in Ithaca that are working on the Green New Deal. And I think that I can't think of his name now, but the sustainability coordinator in Ithaca, who is having public meetings on Zoom, is doing the right thing. I don't like the use of all of those capitalist money to do what we need to do in Ithaca, but bringing people who are already involved into our collective work would be, I think, an interesting thing to do.
Teresa, I see you have a direct response, but I'm going to ask that you take it to the breakout room. I put you two in the same breakout room. Wait, did I? No, hang on. I will put you in the same breakout room. So thank you all for questions and comments for Spencer. What we're going to do now is take about 20 minutes to go into breakout rooms. We're just going to have 2 rooms since we're a pretty small group. I'm going to drop